Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5, Chapter 5. So far what have we got? We've got a couple species of justice. Remember, Aristotle is breaking up the notion of justice like he did for the notion or the concept or the idea of good back in Book 1, Chapter 6. We've seen that the good was broken up. There's no single overarching good, and it's not this Platonic notion. Likewise with justice. So we've got a couple of species here. We've looked at species of justice number 1, distributive, had a geometric mathematical analogy. So go back and look at that if you don't recall what that means. And the same thing, arithmetic for rectificatory justice. That was our second species of justice in the previous chapter, chapter 4. Now in this, we're going to have another something I think is more complex. It's related to number 2, and it's also related to number 1. It's a more complex notion of justice, and this is dealing with reciprocity. It's not simple restoration, this idea of just returning evil with evil or good with good. This was the Pythagoreans had this element in Aristotle, is not surprisingly, reacting to the tradition. We've seen him react to Plato. Now he's reacting to the Pythagorean notion. Says this notion of returning evil with evil, good with good, that is too simple. Right? So Aristotle's looking at something that's more of a larger scale notion of justice, a bigger picture, kind of like when Plato was talking about justice being one of the most important questions when you're talking about society. What is justice? Aristotle is along those lines in this sense. He's looked at a variety of kinds of justice, but this is a larger picture of it. And he says what we've got, instead of this simple notion that comes from the Pythagoreans, is a more complex one of a proportionate reciprocation. And proportionate reciprocation, in this case, is this is what this. All right. So this here is a key one. For this proportionate reciprocation, this binds cities together. Okay? This is what is like the glue that holds the city together. So, maybe a little bit of an overstatement, but in any case, it's an extremely important notion of justice for Aristotle. And it's a little more complex than what we've seen. But what we have to think about now is how do we have proportionate when we have, and we saw a little taste of it over here with distributive justice, talking about proportions in the geometric sense, so we're going kind of back to that. Because when you think about it, in a complex society, you've got to try and balance and measure out, make unequal things in some sense equal, not to identify them, but to find out a way to make them commensurate. That is, commensurate just meaning common measure. How do you find common measures between things that look quite different? And what we're going to have is that when you get more complex notions, you're now getting really into the game of politics. You're getting beyond simple transactions. You're moving up into what Aristotle would call the truly human domain. Now, you might be thinking, well, isn't it human all the way down? Aren't you just human in no matter whatever you do? Not really. If you recall, Aristotle breaks up the notion of human activities of the soul, go way back to the beginning of these videos when we were talking about arete and eudaimonia and all those things. It seems like it's quite distant. All that distant from here, all that's going to come back. But if you recall, there were certain activities of soul that Aristotle said we have, and they're in common with other creatures, like activities of soul running your breathing, reproduction, digestion, nutrition, growth, all those kinds of things. You do that as a human being, you do that, but you don't do that qua human being. You do that in virtue of the soul, the vegetative part of your soul. Well, a lot of this now is going to look at what's uniquely human. This is uniquely human. Non-human animals, Aristotle wouldn't use that term, he'd just say animals, but today we'd say non-human animals have nothing like this. This is a truly human aspect of justice. So this is going to be a big one, and where we are binding into city. Like, even though ants have huge colonies, they don't have anything like this. They're not bound together like this. Other things would bind ants together in colonies, but it wouldn't be anything like this, because they don't produce goods in the same way and get into complex exchanges of goods. Even though, yes, ants and bees do produce goods, but they don't exchange them and become reliant on each other in the same way that humans do. So this is uniquely human. Keep that in mind. So this is going to be a very important notion of justice. So how to illustrate this? Let's take some simple examples, and then I'll return back to this notion of why it's uniquely human. Well, a simple example, let's say you steal some food from someone, and you eat the food. So you're hungry or whatever. I'm not too worried about the motivations, just the actions themselves. So you steal some food from someone, and presumably it's because you don't have food. So that's part of the little thought experiment. So you don't have food, you steal some food, and you eat it. Well, now the stolen good, right, the food, the loaf of bread, or whatever it happens to be, is gone. So what do you do now? There's not just, you just don't have a simple exchange here, because maybe the reason, well, you ate the food because you were hungry and you didn't have any bread or anything. So you're not a baker, so you don't have the ability to say, oh, well, I stole a loaf of bread, and then I just make a loaf of bread and give the loaf back. So it's a little more complex like that than just returning. So how does the law figure out to make that equivalence, right? What can we say that, let's say you stole the loaf of bread from Sally, what can we do to compensate Sally when you can't make a loaf of bread and just give her a loaf of bread back and return the balance? It's more complex than that. So there has to be some sort of proportionate to something else. You got to bring in other factors, and you have to figure out what's proportionate to a loaf of bread. So now you're starting to look at different kinds of objects and trying to figure out proportions, and the whole idea of proportions means that there's a common measure underneath. If you say A is proportionate to B, there has to be some kind of measurement of them that you can put them in that relationship. They have to be commensurate in some way, having a common measure. Other examples would be more long-term ones. Like, for instance, if you're a builder, right, and you can build houses, and somebody down the street is a cobbler, a shoemaker, and makes shoes, obviously. And you don't make shoes, but you need to wear shoes while you're building houses, and the cobbler needs a building in order to do his work to make shoes. So you're in some kind of agreement or some sort of mutual need, as Aristotle says, it's born out of our needs, but we structure these things to accommodate our needs, and so we can satisfy our needs, and we have a division of labor. So how do we make this where we can start equating in some way of houses, buildings, like large-scale projects, and smaller ones like shoes, which both are necessary. You need houses and buildings to live in, and you need shoes to wear. So how do we do that? How do we make, so the question is different things, right? Different things like houses and shoes and loaves of bread and all these things. How to make them different things, shall we say, equal. Not identical, but how can we trade in terms of them? How can we build up systems that we can live as human beings, right? Well, in this sense, it's quite straightforward. What do? We introduce another kind of term. We introduce the notion of money. So in that sense, you have to figure out some way to make things equal, or in other words, to put them into proportions. All right? And the way to do that is, with all this, how to do this is you have to have a notion of value, So we have an abstraction that, well, the loaf of bread has so much value, the shoe has value, the house has value. How do we flesh out that concept of value? So you just have the notion, an abstract concept of value. Now, what can we express that in? Well, Aristotle says, well, how do we express value? To get something that makes other things in proportion or in some way equal, that we can relate the two? Not surprisingly. That's money. Right? So the whole idea of making things proportionate or making them quote unquote equal in some way is you have to have some common measure, and value, their common value, is going to be expressed in terms of money. So money is really our common measure. And Aristotle goes into a little bit with respect to the notion of money, right? He talks a little bit about, because in order to make these things, we agree they have value. How are we going to express value? Well, we're going to express it in terms of money. Now, but this isn't a straightforward question, and Aristotle recognizes this. Think about if you've ever bought a used car, like especially if it's been a private deal or on a car lot or whatnot. If you buy a used car, you agree that the medium of exchange will be money. Of course, you're not going in there and bartering. You're going to walk in with money, and you're going to say something like, well, the car seller, the car salesperson thinks the car has value. I agree the car has value. We try to express the value in terms of a common measure, namely money. But, of course, although you agree that the expression of value is through this commensurate notion of money, you're going to disagree on what the actual dollar figure is, or usually, and depending how far it is, then you start negotiating. Well, this is where you have a fairly abstract notion coming into play here, is that when we agree and we look at money, Aristotle says, this is actually a convention, because money in and of itself is not it's an expression of value, but we didn't have to do it. We could have not had money. You couldn't have really complex notions of exchange without money. But money is a convention, Aristotle says. So, and the word nomisma, which is the Greek term for basically, for coins, right? Coins or currency. Money, basically. This is the Greek word for money, nomisma. Numismatics is the study of coins and money. That's where we get that term. So nomisma is like coins or money. And it's interesting, Aristotle notes that it has a relationship to this term, nomos. And nomos means convention. And by convention, we mean sort of rules or some sort of idea that the community agrees to follow. Because if we all got together and just decided that money didn't mean anything, then all the coins and the currency that the government stamps out, it wouldn't be worth anything. And as a matter of fact, we see that can happen. If economies fail, go into history, dig through the history books, and you see when economies fail, they say things like, well, the money's not worth the paper it's printed on. And if you look at extreme examples of that, like in the Weimar Republic and things like that, where the government was printing money like crazy because the inflation went through the roof, that the whole notion of money was almost going out the window in the society. So what's going to be this convention is just that. It's the expression of what the public agrees upon. So value is a common measure expressed in money, but it's ultimately tied to the idea of a convention. And a convention, what really is that? Well, this is really just public agreement. Right? So the public agrees that value will be expressed as money. And then how do you determine the precise dollar value of something? Well, when you go to buy an object, it's usually what people are willing to pay for it. So when you go and buy especially if you go and buy you get this idea of differences of value when you go and, let's say you buy a used car or you buy some old collector thing, and you go in and you talk to the person, and if you say something like, well, I'll offer you so much, and the person says, no, I want more. Well, the question is how do you evaluate what it's worth? Aristotle recognizes that there's different conventions at play, and one of it might be something like, well, it's valuable to me, so I'll put more of a dollar value on it. But if your response is, well, I look at what the market value is, that's an expression of a public convention. What the public is agreeing to pay for something. That's the notion of value as expressed as a public convention. In other words, really, a public agreement. So here we've got the whole notion of a truly human aspect of society, because with proportionate reciprocation that binds cities together, we're really talking about standards that are conventions. And these are really human activities, the construction of things that we agree are expressions of value and that we agree to live by. Well, once you're in that game of talking about what binds cities together and what we agree, this is now the emergence of an abstraction, like a notion of value, and then fleshing it out with something, not from the natural world, but fleshing it out with something like money, which is not, the world wasn't made with money in it. We created it. We, as human beings, have invented the notion of money, and we have all kinds of agreements about it, and we get these conventions, and that's what binds us together. So these created notions, these abstractions, they bind us together, and that's how we can create cities. These are ongoing transactions and Aristotle even recognizes that things can gain and lose value. Money can be worth more and less. So he even had a very, shall we say, an embryonic notion of inflation, right? Money does change its value. When we say things like a dollar doesn't buy what it used to be. The Canadian government doesn't make pennies anymore. Why? Because they're too expensive. Like costs more than 1 cent to make a penny. So the whole idea of money being a convention, it means it can also change. Right? So money, too, is a part of human activity. It's all human at this level. This is what makes us truly unique, and this is why Aristotle will say at the end, well, this more or less summarizes a rough idea of all of justice. And he says it's a rough idea. It's not the complete story. But once we get to here, we're now really in the domain of political justice. So we now have the different species. Keep in mind that there's different kinds of justice. What is it for? What's the circumstance in which it's offering? And clearly, Aristotle has broken once again with Plato, not having a notion of general justice, but more or less kind of working his way up through distribution, rectificatory, and then eventually this more complex notion of justice as a kind of special and complex reciprocity. And so with that notion, he's going to then move on and make a few more comments in the later chapters on the notion of justice, and I'll return to those in later videos. So stay tuned. Thanks.